Welcome back to the France 24 debate. Now, in Italy, racially motivated attacks have been on the rise in recent weeks. And as well as the anonymous incidents which take place daily, even public figures have been victims too. Athlete Daisy Osakue was attacked while walking home near Turin. Born in Italy to Nigerian parents, the discus thrower may not be able to compete in the upcoming European Championships because of her injuries. She describes here what happened.
I felt a strong strike on my eye. I threw myself on the ground, and when I touched my face, I felt this liquid. I was scared. I thought it was acid. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm sure it was an act of racism.
Well, to discuss the issue in more depth, I'm joined now by Alberto Castelvecchi, Professor of Public Communications at the Guido Carli University in Rome, and by Lorenzo Marsili of the European Alternatives NGO. Thank you for joining us, Lorenzo and Alberto. Lorenzo, I'd just like to start with that question here. Interior Minister Matteo Salvini of the far-right Lega Party has brushed off claims that racism is on the rise in Italy, calling it nonsense. Would you say that it is indeed nonsense, as Salvini suggests?
This is part of a very clear strategy. The concept that can help us understand it is probably that of the overtone window, which refers to the window of acceptability in public debate. What can be said without sounding extremist or outlandish? And what Salvini is doing is condoning overtly racist statements, minimizing racial attacks in the country in order to pass his own government policy based on institutional racism as something acceptable, moderate even, compared to the kind of racial attacks we see on the streets. The reason for this is rather simple. Salvini needs a country that accepts an institutionalized racism because he needs somebody to scapegoat. This government is not going to be able to do anything for the economic plight of Italians. The strategy that it is going to adopt is to scapegoat the foreigner, to scapegoat the migrant for what it cannot deliver economically. And to do so successfully, it needs to anesthetize the Italian public towards its own racist policies. And this is what really this minimization is all about.
OK, Lorenzo, there you mentioned institutionalized racism when it comes to the Lega Party. Some would say the very presence of that party in the government and their anti-immigrant rhetoric has fueled this social climate or even stoked racially motivated attacks. Alberto, I'd like to bring you in. To what extent would you say that's true?
Well, the point is that how much communication is creating reality here, because until now, the Salvini operation, the Lega operation, and what you've seen in Italy now, could just look like and sound like a game of words and a game of symbols. But at the moment, what is happening is that this game of symbols and words is creating a different perception of what Italy is. And this could create a different reality. So we are afraid that the perception of what Italy is in the world, and most of all in European cooperation, could be shifted and dramatically changed by this kind of policies. Salvini's policies, not only the government, but the interior minister's policies, that, as you know, are very aggressive.
Now, you mentioned symbols and demonstrations. I'd like to flag up something there. Speaking of symbols, Senator Tony Iwobi is among those drafting the hardline immigration policy. And I'd like to ask you, Lorenzo, he's the first black senator to serve in the upper house for the Lega Party. What do you make of that decision on the part of Salvini?
Well, it is brilliant communication. He is the first black senator, but Italy had a black integration minister in the government of Enrico Letta just a few years ago. So the presence of second-generation migrants in Italian politics, fortunately, is not something new, nor is it something that the Lega Nord has invented. But I think what was being said about the power of communication really hits the correct note, because what we're witnessing is a government that transforms its own political incapacity into a spectacle, and the spectacle is what is meant to maintain the government in power. But let me just say one thing, because it is true that Italy is coming across as a racist country, but we should be very careful and understand that this is a very general phenomenon where in a majority of European and indeed Western countries, you have a significant minority of the population that is ready to take up and live up to, when given the opportunity, racist views. The problem that Italy faces is not merely the fact that these views are now being condoned by a racist government, is that Italy lacks a serious political opposition that can give a right of place and a political belonging and a political voice to the other half of the country, which is on a very different level when it comes to questions of integration and migration. We need a force that is able to give power and voice to the other Italy that exercises its humanity every single day, welcoming migrants and defending them publicly and institutionally.
And of course, to touch on that socio-economic context, you're saying that Italy might be perceived erroneously, perhaps, as a racist country. Something you often hear in the country is that traditionally it's a country of emigration, not immigration. They've not had the same post-colonial experience, which could be compared to, say, the UK or France, and this is therefore new to them. Does this historical argument stand up these days?
Well, you don't need to be very historical about it. In 2017, there were approximately 150,000 migrants coming into Italy and over 200,000 emigrants, that is to say, Italians that are leaving Italy. The net migration is unfortunately negative, which means that Italy exports more people than the number of people coming into the country. And once again, the focus of this government is to place the accent on those coming in order to hide the situation of those going out of the country. It is migration in order not to speak about the economy. Unless we manage to break this extraordinarily perverse game of abdication of political responsibility, I think the way that we're looking the government to move in the months and possibly years ahead is to not solve the migration challenge precisely in order to have something else to talk about than its own economic inefficiency.
Now, Alberto, I'd like to come back to Alberto there, who mentioned something about symbolic communications and strategies. Former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi recently posted a photo of black and mixed-race Italian athletes on social media, congratulating these women on their success, saying it was good news, in contrast to a Liga rally that had also been in the news that day. Do you think this was a purely political move or an effort to push Italians in a more progressive direction?
Well, I think, yes, Matteo Renzi was somehow very smart. He had a good hand in posting these pictures of black athletes, on the web. But somehow this is instrumental, as much as Salvini's communications is instrumental. And the very, very bad consequence of the bad consequence of all this is that it's making the debate very poor, because as we heard from our friend the senator, the debate is not exactly are you black or are you white, but the debate is about the structure of immigration itself in Italian society. But nobody's keeping the level of the debate at this height, and everybody's lowering the debate. Just, are you pro or anti-immigrant? Are you pro or anti-law measures against people coming as refugees, etc.? So even if I'm afraid, I am really afraid of Mr. Salvini's communication, and most of all of his way to manage the Interior Ministry. I'm at the same time, I'm quite afraid of the really surface communication that Matteo Renzi is waving about racism. Nobody's taking that really seriously, and it's a really serious matter, because you have to consider that in Italy we have some 5 million legal immigrants who work as entrepreneurs, traders, housewives, shop floor workers, and then you have some 400,000, 500,000 who are the so-called illegal immigrants. So the big mass of Italian immigrants, foreign immigrants, are absolutely legal. So the level of the debate has been lowered by Salvini, but even Renzi's provocation are more or less the same level.
You mentioned the important question here of structures, mechanisms that really do contribute to fostering integration and helping immigrants start a new life or move on to where they're going. Italy has complained about a lack of support from the EU in the past. Has there been any progress on that issue? Is that a legitimate criticism?
Well, yes, somehow it is. There is just one, I often tell my students in the Lewis University, in all these bad things that we are seeing from Salvini's posture on immigration, maybe there is at least one little good consequence, is that the attention on sharing the burden with other European countries has been a bit more vibrant in the last weeks. So the other European countries, and I mentioned particularly Spain and France, are somehow helping us in trying to share this burden. So even if the communication our government has been keeping on racism and on immigration is very bad, it's very low quality, at least there is one good consequence, which is the common understanding that it's a European problem, it's a European burden, and we should discuss that together, or at least we should redesign together the lines of policy we want to keep in front of this problem.
Lorenzo, I'd like to bring you in on that and ask for your reaction on the European scale of this issue. Do you think the necessary level of solidarity between European countries and concrete measures between European countries is actually happening for Italy?
Well, yes, because every
of
country
not,
has gone
which
its
does
own
not
way.
justify keeping people.
Do continue.
Sorry, we overlapped there.
No, go ahead.
There has been an extraordinary lack of transnational solidarity when it comes to the management of migration flows at European Union level. That, it should be said in the clearest of manners, in no way condones taking human beings hostage at sea with all the deadly consequences that has in order to try and trigger a policy change at EU level. It is not on people's lives that policy change can come about. And in fact, this technique of Matteo Salvini is isolating Italy. It is not helping to solve and to reach a common European management of the migration challenge, on which I think we can say two things. The first is that the same communication or optical maneuver that Salvini is making is very common to the leaders of France, of Germany, in fact, of the majority of European countries. 100,000 or 200,000 people coming into a continent of 500 million people are not an emergency. This is a structural movement of people that has to be governed in ways that are not emergency-led. For instance, the European Union would direly need to open up again the possibility of taking up a job-seeking visa for the Schengen area directly in countries of origin, providing in that way an alternative to the deadly journeys that kill people in the deserts and in the Mediterranean Sea. The European Union has a very good blueprint of how a shared management of arrivals could be handled. It is the European Parliament resolution on reforming the Dublin system. It is a very good resolution passed by a majority of European policymakers that is being brushed aside and kept in the drawers of the chancelleries of the European Union. Unfortunately, Salvini is only the symptom of a malaise that is much more widespread and is present in Paris as much as it is in Berlin, as much as it is in the new nationalist populist government of Italy.
I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us, Lorenzo and Alberto. Do stay with us here on France 24. There's more news coming up in just a moment.